My name is Catherine Whitman, and in 1973, I was a 24-year-old sociology graduate student from Stanford University when I fell in love with a man who would cost me everything I had been born to inherit: my family's fortune, my place in California's agricultural elite, and my future as an heiress to one of the largest grape-growing operations in the Central Valley. His name was Eduardo Morales, and he was a 26-year-old Mexican farm worker and union organizer who was leading strikes against the very vineyards that had made my family wealthy for 3 generations. What I couldn't have anticipated was that loving someone who represented everything my family's business was fighting against would force me to choose between inherited privilege and authentic justice, between family loyalty and moral conviction, between the comfortable life I had always known and the uncertain future I would build with a man who saw me first as the enemy's daughter and only later as the woman he could love. I grew up on Whitman Estates, a 5,000-acre vineyard operation in Fresno County that had been built by my great-grandfather in the 1890s and had grown into one of California's most profitable agricultural enterprises. Our Spanish-style mansion overlooked endless rows of grapevines that produced the premium wine grapes and table grapes that had made the Whitman family wealthy enough to influence state politics, fund university programs, and live like aristocracy in a region where water rights and land ownership determined social hierarchy. The comfortable world of my upbringing was maintained by the labor of Mexican and Mexican-American workers who lived in company housing, shopped at company stores, and worked under conditions that my family considered generous compared to other agricultural operations, but which I would later understand were exploitative by any reasonable standard of human dignity. The workers were invisible to me during my childhood, brown-skinned people who appeared in the fields when work needed to be done and disappeared into their separate world when the harvest was complete. Catherine, you need to understand that we provide employment for hundreds of families who would have nothing without the opportunities we create. My father, Richard Whitman, would explain whenever I occasionally questioned the obvious disparities between our comfortable lifestyle and the poverty I glimpsed in the workers' housing areas. Agriculture is a business, not a charity. We pay fair wages for honest work, and everyone benefits when the operation is profitable and successful. My awakening to the realities of agricultural labor began during my undergraduate years at Stanford, where sociology courses introduced me to concepts of social justice, economic inequality, and the systematic exploitation of minority workers that characterized much of California's agricultural industry. The readings about migrant labor, working conditions, and the growing United Farm Workers movement forced me to examine my family's business with new eyes and to question assumptions I had absorbed throughout my privileged childhood. The research project that would change my life began innocently enough, a senior thesis on labor organizing in California agriculture that my faculty advisor suggested I approach through direct observation and interviews with both workers and management. My family connections provided access to vineyard operations throughout the Central Valley, while my academic credentials gave me legitimacy with union organizers who were usually suspicious of outsiders, especially those connected to the agricultural establishment they were fighting. The first time I encountered Eduardo Morales was at a United Farm Workers meeting in a small church in Delano, where Cesar Chavez's movement was organizing support for the Grape Boycott that was beginning to pressure agricultural employers throughout California. Eduardo was addressing a crowd of farm workers in Spanish, his voice carrying a passion and conviction that was obvious even to someone like me, who understood only fragments of what he was saying. "Nosotros no somos esclavos," he declared, his words electrifying the audience. "We are not slaves. We are human beings who deserve dignity, fair wages, and safe working conditions. The time has come to demand what justice requires, not beg for what charity might provide." The translation I received later revealed that Eduardo was articulating exactly the kind of analysis I had been reading about in my academic studies, but hearing it from someone who lived the reality rather than studying it academically gave the words a power and urgency that no textbook could convey. After the meeting, I approached Eduardo to request an interview for my research project, introducing myself only as a Stanford student writing about labor organizing without mentioning my family connections to the industry he was fighting. His response was cautious but interested, as he recognized the value of having academic documentation of the workers' perspective on the labor disputes that were beginning to reshape California agriculture. "Why does a Stanford student care about farm workers?" Eduardo asked, his English accented but fluent, his dark eyes studying my face with obvious suspicion. Most university people, they study us like insects, write papers about our problems, but never do anything to help change the conditions that create those problems. His challenge forced me to examine my own motivations more honestly than I had previously been willing to do. "I'm trying to understand how social change happens," I replied, "and whether academic research can contribute to justice or just to the careers of people who study injustice without addressing it." My response seemed to satisfy him enough to agree to a formal interview, though I could sense that he remained skeptical about my intentions and my commitment to anything beyond academic advancement. The conversation that followed was my first real education about the daily realities of agricultural labor. The exposure to pesticides that caused illness and birth defects, the piece rate pay system that forced workers to prioritize speed over safety, the company housing that was overcrowded and substandard, the lack of clean drinking water and bathroom facilities in the fields, and the constant threat of deportation that kept workers from complaining about dangerous or illegal working conditions. "Miss Whitman," Eduardo said during our interview, using the surname I had provided without revealing its significance in the agricultural community, "you want to understand how social change happens? It happens when people decide they would rather risk everything fighting for dignity than continue accepting conditions that treat them as less than human. It happens when workers organize together and refuse to let employers divide them through fear and competition. Besides, before you continue this powerful journey of love across class lines and the struggle for justice with us, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories about the individuals who chose principle over privilege and found that love could bridge even the deepest social and economic divides." The weeks that followed our initial interview drew me deeper into the world of farmworker organizing, as Eduardo introduced me to families who shared their stories of exploitation, illness, and hope for change. I attended meetings, rallies, and strategy sessions where I witnessed the sophisticated political analysis and organizational skills that contradicted every stereotype I had absorbed about Mexican laborers being simple, uneducated people who were grateful for any work they could find. The more time I spent with Eduardo and other union organizers, the more I began to understand that my family's vineyard operation was not the benevolent enterprise I had been raised to believe it was, but rather a business model built on the systematic exploitation of workers who had no power to negotiate fair treatment or safe working conditions. The generous wages my father claimed to pay were actually below poverty level, while the company housing was overcrowded and lacked basic amenities that my family considered essential for human habitation. "Eduardo, I need to tell you something about my background," I finally said during one of our conversations, unable to continue participating in the movement without revealing my connection to the industry they were fighting. "My family owns Whitman Estates. I'm not just a student studying agricultural labor, I'm the daughter of one of the employers you're organizing against." His reaction was immediate and intense, a mixture of anger, betrayal, and disappointment that made clear how much trust I had violated by concealing my identity. "You lied to me," he said, his voice controlled but his eyes flashing with hurt and fury. "You sat in our meetings, listened to our strategies, learned about our plans, and all the time, you were the enemy's daughter, gathering information that could be used against us." The pain in his voice was almost unbearable, as I realized that my deception had not only betrayed his personal trust, but had potentially endangered the organizing work that was so important to improving conditions for thousands of workers. "Eduardo, I didn't lie to hurt you or the movement," I said desperately. "I lied because I was afraid you wouldn't talk to me if you knew who my family was, and I needed to understand the truth about what was happening in the fields. But I'm not my father, and I'm not my family's business. I'm someone who has learned that everything I was taught about our operation was wrong." The revelation of my true identity created a crisis not only in my relationship with Eduardo, but in my understanding of myself and my place in the world. For the first time in my life, I was forced to confront the reality that my comfortable existence had been built on the exploitation of people like the man I was falling in love with, and that every advantage I had enjoyed, my education, my social status, my financial security, had come at the cost of other people's suffering and deprivation. Eduardo's initial reaction was to cut off all contact with me, viewing my continued presence in the movement as a security risk and a betrayal of the workers who had shared their stories and strategies with someone they believed was a sympathetic outsider. "Catherine, You cannot understand what it means to trust someone with information that could destroy our families if it reaches the wrong people, he told me during our painful confrontation. Your father has the power to have workers deported, to blacklist organizers, to destroy our movement if he knows what we're planning. How can I know that you won't go back to your comfortable life and share what you've learned? The accusation was entirely reasonable, given the power dynamics that characterize the relationship between agricultural employers and their workers, but it also demonstrated how completely Eduardo misunderstood my own transformation and the depth of my commitment to the cause I had come to embrace. The weeks I had spent learning about working conditions, attending organizing meetings, and witnessing the courage of people who were risking everything to fight for basic dignity had changed me in ways that made it impossible to return to my previous ignorance and complicity. Eduardo, I can't undo the fact that I was born into the family that I was born into, I said during one of our conversations about whether our relationship could survive the revelation of my background. But I can choose what I do with the knowledge and privilege that family background has given me. I can use my access to information and resources to help the movement instead of helping my family resist the changes that justice requires. The decision to openly side with the United Farm Workers against my own family's business interests was the most difficult choice I had ever made, requiring me to reject not only my financial inheritance, but my social identity and family relationships that had defined my entire life. The conversation with my parents about my involvement with the labor movement was explosive and heartbreaking as I watched their disappointment and anger when they realized that their daughter had become an ally of the people they considered enemies of their business and their way of life. Catherine, you've been brainwashed by communist agitators who are using you to attack everything this family has built, my father declared, his voice shaking with rage and incomprehension. These people aren't interested in fair wages or better working conditions. They want to destroy the agricultural system that provides food for the entire country. And they're using you as a weapon against your own family because they know your involvement will give them credibility and access they could never achieve on their own. My mother's response was more emotional, but equally devastating, as she pleaded with me to abandon my involvement with the farm worker movement and return to the life path that had been planned for me since childhood. Darling, this isn't who you are, she sobbed. You're a Whitman, from one of California's most respected families. You have responsibilities to your heritage and your future that you can't just throw away for some romantic notion about helping people who will never appreciate your sacrifice. The economic pressure was immediate and comprehensive. My parents cut off my financial support, removed me from the family trust that would have provided lifelong security, and made clear that continued involvement with the labor movement would result in permanent estrangement from the family and exclusion from the inheritance that had been my birthright. The comfortable future that had been planned for me, marriage to someone from an appropriate family, a position managing charitable foundations, and eventual inheritance of a major portion of the family wealth, disappeared overnight. But the personal transformation I had experienced through my involvement with the farm worker movement had already made that comfortable future seem morally unacceptable. I can't build my happiness on other people's suffering, I told my parents during our final confrontation. I can't enjoy wealth that comes from exploiting workers who don't earn enough to feed their families. I can't pretend that the system that made us rich is just or sustainable or compatible with basic human dignity. The integration into the farm worker community was challenging for someone who had grown up with every privilege that money could provide. Learning to live on the minimal income I earned from part-time jobs while completing my graduate studies, sharing cramped apartments with other activists, and adjusting to a lifestyle that prioritized social justice over personal comfort required fundamental changes in my values and expectations. Eduardo's gradual acceptance of my genuine commitment to the movement was hard-won and constantly tested, as he struggled to reconcile his feelings for me with his awareness of the class and cultural differences that separated our backgrounds. Catherine, I love you, but I need you to understand what it means to choose this life, he told me during one of our conversations about the future. It means poverty, it means constant struggle, it means being hated by people like your family and never being fully accepted by people like mine. Are you prepared for a lifetime of being an outsider in both worlds? His question forced me to confront the reality that loving Eduardo meant more than just accepting him as an individual. It meant choosing to identify with the Mexican-American farmworker community and accepting the discrimination and hardship that choice would entail. The middle ground I had initially hoped to occupy, supporting the movement while maintaining my family relationships and social status, was proving impossible to sustain. The wedding ceremony that Eduardo and I held in 1974 was both a celebration of our love and a political statement about solidarity across class and ethnic lines. The service was conducted in Spanish and English at a small Catholic church in Delano, with Cesar Chavez himself offering a blessing for our marriage and acknowledging the symbolic importance of our union for the broader movement for farmworker rights. Today we celebrate not just the love between Eduardo and Catherine, Chavez said during the ceremony, but the possibility of justice and equality that their marriage represents. When people choose love over prejudice, principle over privilege, and solidarity over separation, they create hope for a better world where all people can live with dignity and respect. The reception was held in the Union Hall, with food prepared by farmworker families who had become my chosen community and music that celebrated the cultural heritage I was learning to embrace as my own. The absence of my biological family was painful but expected, as they had maintained their position that my marriage represented a betrayal of everything they had taught me about appropriate behavior and social responsibility. The early years of our marriage were marked by both the joy of building a life together and the ongoing challenges of Eduardo's dangerous work as a union organizer in an industry that often responded to labor activism with violence and intimidation. Death threats, surveillance, and economic pressure were constant realities, while the physical demands of organizing work left Eduardo exhausted and sometimes absent for weeks at a time as he traveled throughout California building support for the movement. My own role in the struggle evolved from supporter to active participant, as I used my education and communication skills to help document working conditions, write grant proposals for union programs, and serve as a bridge between the farm worker movement and sympathetic academics, journalists, and religious leaders who could provide resources and publicity for the cause. Catherine brings something to our movement that we never had before, observed Dolores Huerta, the co-founder of the United Farm Workers, during one of our strategy meetings. She understands how power operates in the agricultural industry because she grew up inside that system, but she's chosen to use that knowledge to help workers rather than exploit them. That combination of access and commitment is incredibly valuable for our organizing work. The success of the Grape Boycott and the eventual recognition of the United Farm Workers as the legitimate representative of agricultural laborers was a victory that Eduardo and I had worked toward together, but it also marked a transition point in both the movement and our personal lives as we began to focus more on building stable institutions rather than conducting dramatic confrontations with growers. The decade that followed our marriage was marked by significant victories for the farm worker movement and corresponding challenges for our relationship, as Eduardo's prominence as a labor leader brought both recognition and increased pressure from forces that opposed agricultural reform. The passage of the California Agricultural Labor Relations Act in 1975 represented the achievement of goals that had seemed impossible when I first encountered the movement, but it also created new responsibilities and expectations that tested our commitment to both the cause and to each other. Eduardo's appointment as a regional director for the United Farm Workers brought a steady salary and official recognition that allowed us to move out of shared apartments and into a small house in Delano, where we could finally begin building the stable family life that had been impossible during the most intense years of labor organizing. The simple pleasure of having our own space, cooking meals together, and planning for the future felt like luxury after years of uncertainty and constant struggle. The children we welcomed into our family, 2 daughters and a son who grew up bilingual and bicultural, represented both the personal fulfillment we had been seeking and the future we hoped to create through our work for social justice. Our kids learned early about the labor movement that had brought their parents together, attending rallies and meetings where they witnessed democracy in action and absorbed values about standing up for people who couldn't protect themselves. Mija, you need to understand that everything we have came from people who were willing to sacrifice for justice, Eduardo would tell our eldest daughter when she asked about our family's history and our commitment to activism. Your mother gave up wealth and comfort to fight for what was right, and thousands of farm workers gave up security and safety to demand dignity and fair treatment. You inherit both their courage and their responsibility to continue the struggle. The relationship with my biological family remained fractured, but gradually evolved from complete estrangement to cautious communication as time passed and the initial anger over my choices began to fade. My parents' decision to reach out after the birth of our first child reflected their desire to know their grandchildren, even if they could never fully accept the choices that had led to their existence. "Catherine, I may never understand why you chose the life you chose," my mother wrote in a letter that arrived when our daughter was 2 years old, "but I've come to realize that losing my daughter and my grandchildren is too high a price to pay for maintaining pride or proving a point. If your husband and children are important to you, then maybe it's time for us to learn to see them as family." The gradual reconciliation with my parents was complicated and incomplete, requiring ongoing negotiation about boundaries, respect, and the ways that our different values and loyalties could coexist within a family relationship. My children's relationship with their wealthy grandparents provided them with perspectives on class and privilege that supplemented their understanding of social justice, while my parents' exposure to Eduardo and our kids helped humanize the farmworker community in ways that political arguments had never accomplished. The evolution of California agriculture during the 1980s and 1990s brought new challenges as globalization, mechanization, and corporate consolidation changed the industry that had provided the context for our meeting and our activism. The United Farm Workers faced declining membership and influence as agricultural employers found new ways to avoid union contracts, while Eduardo's work shifted toward broader advocacy for immigrant rights and economic justice that extended beyond traditional farmworker organizing. My own career path led me into social work and community organizing, where I could apply my education and experience to help other families navigate the challenges of poverty, discrimination, and social exclusion that had become familiar through my work with the farmworker movement. The skills I had developed as a labor activist translated effectively into advocacy for affordable housing, healthcare access, and educational opportunities that served the broader Latino community in the Central Valley. What you learned fighting for farm workers prepared you to fight for justice in many different contexts, observed Sister Margaret, the Catholic nun who had become my mentor and colleague in community organizing work. The principles are the same whether you're fighting for fair wages, decent housing, or quality education. It's about recognizing human dignity and demanding that society's institutions serve people rather than exploit them. The recognition that came to both Eduardo and me for our decades of social justice work included awards, speaking invitations, and academic appointments that provided platforms for continuing our advocacy while also achieving the kind of professional success that proved our activism had been principled rather than merely rebellious. Eduardo's appointment as a lecturer at UC Davis allowed him to teach courses on labor history and social movements, while my position as director of a nonprofit organization gave me resources to continue working for policy changes that would benefit working families throughout California. The perspective that time and experience provided helped me understand that my decision to marry Eduardo and support the farmworker movement had been not just about love and justice, but about discovering my authentic identity and purpose in a world that had offered me comfort and privilege in exchange for moral blindness. The inheritance I had lost, money, property, and social status, had been replaced by something more valuable, a life of meaning, a partnership based on shared values, and children who understood that their advantages created obligations to help others. I don't regret losing my inheritance. I often tell young people who ask about the choices I made during the 1970s. I regret that I was raised to think wealth and comfort were more important than justice and human dignity. The life I built with Eduardo taught me that real security comes from being part of a community that cares for all its members, not from accumulating enough money to isolate yourself from other people's problems. The marriage that had begun during the Grape Boycott of the 1970s became a symbol of the possibility for love and justice to overcome the barriers created by class, ethnicity, and economic interest. Our relationship proved that people from different backgrounds could build lasting partnerships when they shared fundamental values about human dignity and social responsibility. Looking back on the decision that cost me my inheritance but gave me a life of authentic purpose and deep love, I understand that choosing Eduardo over my family's wealth was not really a sacrifice but an exchange, trading inherited privilege for earned respect, material comfort for moral integrity, and social status for genuine community. The Great Boycott that brought us together had been about more than wages and working conditions. It had been about the possibility of creating a society where everyone could live with dignity, regardless of their background or the circumstances of their birth. The farmworker who had challenged me to examine my privilege and my principles became my partner in building a life that honored both the struggles of his community and the possibilities that my advantages could create when used for justice rather than exploitation. Our love story became part of the larger narrative of social change in California, proving that personal transformation and political progress could reinforce each other when people had the courage to choose principle over convenience. The inheritance I lost was measured in dollars and property, but the inheritance I gained, a family built on love and justice, a community committed to human dignity, and a life lived according to authentic values, was beyond any financial calculation. The woman who married a Mexican farm worker during the Grape Boycott discovered that real wealth comes not from what you own, but from what you contribute, and that the most valuable inheritance is the one you create through your own choices and commitments.